Okay, Diego, you're good. Recording's going.
All right. Did it say something about recording in progress, people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Lots of headnotes. All right. Thanks, Jay. Appreciate the intro. Okay. So I'm sure all of us here have had a moment like this, right? It's a great feeling. You just sort of click and you're just completely on the same page with someone else and you both know it. This kind of mental synchrony can help us feel connected and feel more sure of what's going on. And it can help us coordinate actions together and achieve collective goals. It's a kind of mental alignment that enables us to work together and solve problems or come to build consensus. So sometimes we're on the same wavelength about something with someone and that can help us coordinate, but also sometimes we're just not on the same page, right? We have different interpretation of events or we don't see things the same way. And this is true especially when things are ambiguous and social verification helps us feel certain about reality. But it's also true in today's polarized climate when even agreed upon facts seem up for dispute. And sometimes, of course, mental synchrony can go a little too far, as during groupthink, if too many of us see things the same way, it might stifle our creativity or ability to see truth. And these themes map onto the 3 papers I'm going to overview for us today. Each paper examines the theme of how people's minds align and the consequences of doing so for collective behavior. And it does so through a different domain and lens of analysis, from social neuroscience to traditional social psychology to meta-science. And throughout, I hope to emphasize the importance of studying collective phenomena that's inherently embedded in the social context. Okay, so this first paper is a project I worked on. I looked at how people's brains actually synchronized, and it was actually published earlier this year. So one way to look at how people's minds align is to look at how people's brains actually synchronize when they're interacting with others. Doing so can help us better understand the conditions under which synchrony increases or decreases, while also maximizing ecological validity. But for a long time, we've studied people's brains in isolation as they lay alone in an fMRI scanner or in a shielded EEG chamber. And so researchers have been trying to figure out how do we go from this sort of isolated single brain approach, which isn't really what our social world looks like, although maybe during the pandemic, we've all been kind of boxed up, to a more multi-brain approach, which was once called the dark matter of social neuroscience. And over the past 20 years, we've actually seen a huge growth and interest in studying people's brains simultaneously as they interact. Most of this new research has looked at interactions between 2 people, but in contrast, comparatively little research has explored these neural dynamics in groups of 3 or more people. Studying groups is important not only because we often work together in teams in our day-to-day lives, but also because social identities and group processes like process loss or groupthink become more relevant when you move beyond dyads to groups. Studying group dynamics also bears on age-old questions about trying to identify the key ingredients for a successful team, which, although people have studied for decades, we still don't have down to an exact science. Just as an example, a few years ago, Google studied almost 200 of their own teams trying to figure out what ingredients made for the perfect team. And guess what? Despite all their data and modeling wizardry, they had almost no clue. As one of their managers said, we looked at 180 teams from all over the company. We had lots of data, but there's nothing showing that a mix of specific personality types or skills or backgrounds made any difference. At Google, we're good at finding patterns, and there weren't strong patterns here. So maybe there's something we're missing. So we wanted to target this gap and examine interbrain synchrony in groups and whether it's related to collective performance in teams. We thought if people are part of a team and there's interdependence between them to reach a shared goal, we might see more interbrain synchrony between teammates, which might predict collective performance. Okay, so to test the role of brain synchrony in collective performance in larger groups, we recruited groups of 4 to the lab and outfitted each person with a mobile EEG headset. Then we randomly assigned groups to either the team or individual condition, and people would complete problem-solving tasks either collectively as a team or individually competitively. Now, importantly, we included an equal number of groups of individuals as part of sort of a control group in a way, as they would be doing the exact same tasks. So they would be sort of having the same sort of information processing as they're looking at the same tasks and problem-solving issues that would come up, but they wouldn't have any sort of social coordination going on. There would be no sort of group identity. That was part of it. And then we looked at whether brain synchrony could predict collective performance. Okay, so we calculated brain synchrony between people by looking at EEG coherence, which is a type of correlation over time. It essentially measures correlation across trials, where similar phase and amplitude fluctuations over time would lead to higher coherence. So sort of just as a toy example, using members of my committee here, let's say we have Tessa and David's brainwaves highly aligned here, so that would yield higher coherence, whereas maybe we have John and Talia just completely on different pages and wavelengths today, and that would result in much lower coherence. Okay, so here you can see the actual timeline of events in this study, which I'll quickly walk us through. The first stage, again, was just we were randomly assigning groups to either work collectively as a team or independently, and we got some baseline recordings. And then after the group manipulation, participants began working on computerized problem-solving tasks, which varied in the type of task. And so throughout all of these tasks, we were recording EEG from all 4 people simultaneously. And at the very end of the experiment, everyone completed a few survey measures, including a measure of cooperation through a one-shot public goods game, and a few measures of group identification. Okay, so that's a general flow of things, just to give you a sense of kind of how it all went. So now onto some key results. Okay, so first we can look at how synchrony unfolded across the experiment between our 2 conditions. So here on the y-axis, you have group interbrain synchrony, and on the x-axis, we have each of our task periods that we recorded the EEG data from sorted chronologically. And the dashed black line here would just mean no change from the sort of pre-baseline measure that we got. And for the upcoming graphs, the team condition is always going to be in bluish green color, and the individual condition is going to be in red. So when we look at how synchrony unfolded, we actually see that, interestingly, group interbrain synchrony decreased relative to pre-baseline over time for both teams and individuals. However, you'll notice that this decrease gets buffered for teams around the time that problem-solving tasks start. In fact, by the final end baseline measure, synchrony was higher for teams than it was for individuals. Now, this general decline over time could be relative to pre-baseline, could be due to several factors, but what we're most interested in, of course, right, is looking at synchrony's relationship to actual collective problem solving, right? Not just sort of how it descriptively changes, but actually its relationship to other variables, right? So in this case, collective problem solving. Okay, and so here we can ask more directly, does interbrain synchrony predict collective performance? So we can bring in a new graph, and now this time I'm putting interbrain synchrony on the x-axis because now on the y-axis we're going to be predicting group performance. And so as you can see, we actually see a significant interaction such that synchrony predicted collective performance among teams and not among competing individuals. In other words, teams who showed higher interbrain synchrony also performed better on average. And this was exciting because we appeared to have this sort of continuous implicit measure that tracks group performance. But of course, we also wondered if there are other things that might be better predictors of group performance, such as how much people like their group and how cooperative people were with their group mates at the end of the study and that public goods game that we had them do. So we could look at some of these other measures. We can add it all to one model, and we can say, you know, what's predicting group performance best? Is it how much you like your group, or is it some more latent factor, right? And actually, what we see is that interbrain synchrony continues to predict performance after adjusting for some of these self-report behavioral measures. This was quite interesting because we expected highly identified groups to predict performance, yet that wasn't coming out. So here, the best predictor of collective performance in teams was actually interbrain synchrony. So does interbrain synchrony track group dynamics, right? We found that interbrain synchrony predicted collective performance in teams better than self-report. This suggests that interbrain synchrony as an implicit and continuous measure can be informative in understanding collective performance among teams, while self-report or other measures may fail to capture behavior. And since this didn't occur in the individual condition, it suggests something beyond just working on the same task individually and becoming sort of entrained to some similar stimulus maybe, but rather taking into account the actions of others and mutual influence. Of course, there's so much we still don't know, but more broadly, this I think reveals the importance of studying how brains interact in real settings and may open up some new avenues to study why some teams just seem to click and work well and others not so. So this first paper looked at mental alignment through a social neuroscience lens. And the second paper I'm going to take a look at now is going to look at this more through a traditional social psychological approach. And rather than looking at teams and performance, I'm going to look at a different domain where people try and reach consensus and align, and that's in having conversations about real-world morally ambiguous events. And this is a project that's still ongoing. Okay, so I think often when we think about getting on the same page and reaching consensus about maybe a moral issue with other people, we probably bring to mind this kind of image, right? Where people are entrenched on either side of a political aisle, shouting at each other, and it's sort of us versus them mentality. And so the idea that people's moral views change through conversation seems far-fetched. And a lot of research actually would suggest this is true, that our moral beliefs are very stubborn to change. Yet on the other hand, moral views do change. This is just, of course, one example of how views and support for gay marriage have been rapidly changing in our country, but it's almost obvious, right, when you step back and look at how societies and morals have changed over time. And I think the paradox that morality is stubborn yet flexible reveals that our understanding of collective real-world morality, in other words, how moral judgments and views are shaped through actual conversations, is limited. In fact, smaller scale conversations with friends and neighbors are probably the first step in a larger societal conversation that is thought to happen when global morals change. Now, perhaps the most common way we at least try to reach moral consensus, get on the same page, is by listening and talking with other people. In fact, these are the real faces of people who spent a weekend together talking politics and trying to find common ground. It was part of a field experiment called America in One Room. And it even caught the eye of Barack Obama, who reminds us that everyone has a story to tell, and that while we won't always agree or see eye to eye, having these moral conversations isn't optional. And while people's views shifted from this weekend, it doesn't tell us much about why or when people change their moral views, right? And here we are trying to figure out the psychology underlying moral change and how do people come to a shared understanding about moralized issues. Of course, one way we negotiate complex issues is by trying to share reality with others. So I approach this sort of through shared reality theory. And a shared reality is a perception of having the same inner state. So that might be like your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs as another person about something. And shared reality theory says that we have epistemic and relational needs, and that by sharing a reality, we'll fulfill those needs. So in other words, when things are uncertain or there's some ambiguity, we rely on other people both to help make sense of what's going on, but also to sort of build a social connection with them. All right, so we seek connection and verify our beliefs and perception of the world by sharing reality with others. The emergence of a shared reality is often best thought of between two interacting people, as communication naturally affords a medium through which mutual understanding can be readily identified. And in fact, conversations with others is central to how we understand real world events that are complex or ambiguous, or maybe where there's just no consensus. There's perhaps no better example, right, than the COVID-19 global pandemic that we've all been going through, an ongoing moral debate about the acceptability of certain non-essential behaviors, whether it's getting a haircut or traveling, or policies, right, reopening of businesses or the ethics of vaccine distribution. In these moments, we often turn to other people to help us make sense of the situation or establish some sort of moral consensus. Like, what do we all think is appropriate or acceptable? Yet, despite the importance of these conversations and social influence on real-world moral judgments, most of moral psychology has focused on people making judgments on their own. Now, of course, while ambiguity can lead us to engage with other people to help make sense of it, it doesn't mean that we're going to see things the same way or get along. If people see things differently or have different realities, it can cause a lot of social discord, right? And when differences aren't just whether a number is 6 or 9, but maybe more about moralized or political issues, it can lead to real polarization and an inability to reach consensus, which we, especially in the US, but also in other countries, are experiencing. You can see here that polarization has been getting worse over time in the US, and now out-party hate has emerged as a stronger force than in-group love. So when we try to understand how people's moral views and judgments change and unfold, we think there's a gap in the science that's overlooked how people actually rely on others to navigate complex or ambiguous situations. So we ask, how do conversations about real-world morally ambiguous events influence moral judgments, and how do people reach moral consensus? So to study this, we had 284 strangers meet over Zoom, and they viewed real-world headlines and videos that were pre-tested to elicit a range of moral intuitions. In this case, they were all about COVID-19. And then they would make several private judgments, but also have a conversation with their partner and make a mutual judgment about it together. And this was sort of nice because basically we were able to have actual this was during data collected during the pandemic. So we actually have people having conversations over Zoom, but also using a platform that allowed people to have sort of interactive experience where they're able to make ratings privately by themselves and that sort of anonymously to their partner, and also interact with their partner on this interface. Okay. We also wanted to look at ecologically valid real-world everyday scenarios and events that contain some sort of ambiguity or at least lack some consensus, in part because that ambiguity opens up possibility of social influence. So for example, here's a news headline of a guy who stockpiled almost 18,000 bottles of hand sanitizer last year during the pandemic and originally planned to sell them at a marked up price, but then later donated them. So a question here you could ask is, should the man still be penalized for attempting to profit off of hand sanitizer during a pandemic, despite having donated it all to charity now? And these are the kinds of situations that we're asking, and we pre-tested these, and people have lots of different opinions on this, which is good because we actually want that kind of variety of views. And I think that enables us to kind of look at how change happens. So here's sort of an overview of the actual trial structures. People went through this trial, multiple of these trials. They actually went through 9 of them. So here's sort of an overview of how one would look, right? So first you see this headline or video, this initial stimulus, and then you have a pre-conversation set of ratings that you privately make, right? So each person privately rated their moral judgment of the scenario, how certain they were of that judgment, how much they moralized the scenario. So that was sort of a time one. And then people engaged in conversation with their partner, and they talked about their different views. And then we asked them to reach sort of a mutual judgment. Okay, so this is sort of during the conversation phase. And then after the conversation, we asked people the same items that we'd asked them previously, now at time 2, right? So we have this kind of pre and post conversation measures of the same items of your moral judgment, how certain you are, and moralization, so forth. Then we actually gave people a second opportunity to view the stimulus. Maybe your views have changed now that you've had a conversation. We thought maybe it's good to actually give people another chance to look at it, and we can actually capture their time 3 ratings post second viewing. So that's sort of the overview of one trial. Again, they're doing that 9 times. And every few trials, participants would rate their perceived shared reality with their partner and a few other questions about their partner, like how much they trusted their partner's judgments, how moral they thought their partner was, so forth. Okay, so on to some key results. So first we can ask, do moral views change at all, right? As I mentioned earlier, moral views are often stubborn to change. So did people move at all? So here we can actually look and we see that, yes, in fact, moral judgments were shifting from time 1 to time 2 significantly. Right now, a lot of people aren't moving very much, and some people are on some trials are moving quite a bit. And so there's actually a real skew to the data here, right? But nevertheless, people are moving a little bit in their views. And we see that people actually had a change of heart 12% of the time. In other words, when someone's moral judgment was on one side of the scale before the conversation, was on the other side of the scale after the conversation. And we see that people actually shifted substantially in their views about 13% of the time. So are people's moral views changing? Yes, a little bit, not on a wholesale, but we are seeing some movement. Okay, so then we can ask, well, what predicts moral change, right? And we can look at some sort of like rigidity factors, as I'll call them. So in other words, like how entrenched was your view to begin with at time 1? How certain were you? How moralized was the issue? How extreme was your judgment? Maybe those things, if you sort of really stuck to your view at time 1, maybe the conversation is not likely to budge your mind. And so your time 1 judgment is actually probably going to be a great predictor of your time 2 judgment. Right. And we can also look at sort of more conversational factors, like, how much were you moving during the conversation between your initial judgment at time 1 and the mutual judgment during the conversation, and other things like how much of a shared reality do you experience, right? So we can look at some of these rigidity factors and some of these sort of conversational factors and see what predicts moral change. And we see that your collective judgment is 3 times a better predictor than your own time 1 judgment, right? So in other words, this means that people are actually really adopting the collective judgment for their own private time 2 judgment. And that we actually see that this effect is strengthened when they share reality with their partner. Okay. So then we can also ask, not only did people moral views change and what sort of seems to be related to change in general, but are moral views aligning or polarizing, right? So what's happening during these conversations? So here we can look at sort of person A's judgment on the x-axis and person B's on the y. And we can say just sort of in general, what's the relationship or association between these 2 people's judgments over time? So pre-conversation, we can see here that their judgments are slightly aligned, not much though, right? So it's a coefficient of 0.08. So there's actually really almost no association between their judgments before the conversation. And the fact that it's slightly positive maybe just suggests that there's a small degree of similarity or homogeneity in their judgments at the outset, but it's pretty minor, right? And then we can see what happens after the conversation, right? And what we see is after the conversation, we see this striking alignment of moral views. Right. And in fact, this persists at time 3, right? So in other words, before the conversation, their views were actually not that aligned or not really that related. And then after the conversation, they seem incredibly aligned, and that persists over time. Of course, then we can ask what predicts moral alignment, right? So we can look at sort of the different score at time 1. How different were you and your partner's ratings at time 1, and how different were you and your partner's ratings at time 2? And we can sort of compute a different score of those different scores to say, like, are you more aligned at time 2 than you were at time 1? Again, we can look at some of these rigidity factors and conversation factors, as I mentioned earlier. And again, we see that, right, how much you move during the conversation, the malleability during discussion, is predictive of moral alignment. And we, again, also see that shared reality is an important predictor of moral alignment. So again, we're sort of seeing this kind of consistent pattern of the importance of shared reality in predicting moral change and moral alignment. Now, you might also wonder, like, well, what else might be related to moral alignment? And so we had the same thought, and we thought, well, maybe similar demographics would predict moral alignment. So maybe if you're the same race or the same sex, you sort of experience the world in the same way. And so when you're in conversation with someone who's of the same demographic as you, maybe it's easier to get on the same page and align. And so we actually looked at this explicitly, and we actually found that there was no evidence that shared demographics was related to moral alignment. And this is actually in keeping with other research, which suggests that it's really about more like inner states than it is about sort of these broader superficial features of demographic features that's related to moral alignment. So this was a sort of interesting null effect that we saw. And then we looked at a couple of consequences of shared reality, right? So here we're seeing that shared reality is an important predictor of moral change and moral alignment. But we can also say, like, when you're trying to make sense of a situation with someone and you feel like you're on the same page, it can make you feel more certain. This is a prediction of shared reality theory. And actually, we do see that. So you can see here certainty, the distribution of certainty ratings at time 1, 2, and 3. And you see that certainty is actually increasing, particularly from time 1 to time 2, so pre and post conversation. And this sort of indicates that it's not just cheap talk, right? It's not that your moral views are sort of moving around, but you don't really know. It's like, no, your moral views are moving around and you actually feel more certain about them. And we can look at what predicts your own increase in certainty from time 1 to time 2. And again, we see that this is sort of driven by shared reality, right? So the more you share reality with your partner, the more that you feel certain in your own judgment at time 2. And in fact, we also see some nice partner effects here where if your partner also experiences shared reality, that also increases your own certainty. And we have actually a nice little interaction here, albeit a small one, which I'll plot for you, which suggests that, right, that if you and your partner both felt like you were sharing a reality, that predicted even greater increase in your own certainty, right? So if we're really both on the same page, I feel more certain about what happened privately later on in my own time 2 moral judgment. Okay. And lastly, we can look at a couple implications sort of downstream for interpersonal connection and character judgment. So as I mentioned, we had sort of at the end of the study, we had some ratings of your partner and how moral they were and how much you trusted them and how close you felt to them, that sort of thing. And so we can actually look at how shared reality might be predicting some of these sort of like downstream variables. And we can also look at how moral aligning during the study on some of these different scenarios might be related to these factors. So we ran a few models and we found that shared reality and moral alignment were predicting both social connection, so how connected you felt with your partner, how your moral evaluation of your partner, so how much of a moral person you thought they were, and also epistemic trust. In other words, how much you trust your partner's judgment about the different scenarios, right? So what you're seeing here is just sort of a consistent pattern across a bunch of different analyses that shared reality is actually pretty important to predicting not only changes in moral views or alignment, but also sort of downstream consequences, which could actually be important down the road when you think about how people create social networks and decide who to interact with and become friends with, and who they allow to influence them. Okay, so we asked, do conversations change people's moral views? We found that conversations shifted and aligned people's moral views, and that this is best predicted by sharing a reality with a partner with implications for future social interactions. Okay, so here we examined how people can align possibly through conversation, but next I'll look at the risks of possibly being too aligned, in other words, sort of groupthink. And I'll take sort of a more meta-science approach to this next paper. So this next paper looks at a claim that some critics have made that there's a liberal groupthink in psychology and it hampers the quality of our research. And this paper actually came out last year. Okay, so there's a lot of data suggesting that academia and psychology is a liberal bubble. So for example, if you look at the voter registrations of the faculty, you see the ratio of Democrats to Republicans is whopping in some departments. It's always skewed in favor of Democrats, but it's pretty big in some departments. In psychology, it's about 17:1. This is across like 40 different universities that were sampled. Actually, NYU is in these data. So if you pull NYU out and look at NYU, the ratios are even more skewed. So the overall ratio at NYU is 16:1, Democrats to Republicans. And within psychology, it's actually 28:0. And there's actually evidence that this skew has only been getting worse over time. So particularly in the last 50 years, right? So the skew of this ratio of Democrats to Republicans or liberals to conservatives. And so a few years ago, researchers published an article, John Haidt, who's on the call, was on this paper, arguing that political diversity would improve social psychological science. And in the paper, they made a few claims. One, they said that there's a lack of political diversity in psychology, mostly in the last 50 years, which there seems to be pretty good data for. And then they also argue that this lack of political diversity undermines the validity of our social psychological science. And they were presented some interesting anecdotes to sort of back that up, but there hasn't really been a larger scale test of this. But this article actually received widespread attention. It was ranked 7th among all of the articles from this journal, from Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and even splashed onto the New York Times, where the author of the New York Times article speculated that maybe there's this liberal groupthink and that it might be responsible for some of the replicability issues that our field has been facing in the past few years. So this made us think and start to wonder, well, does this mean that there's a liberal groupthink that's making our science less robust or replicable, right? The narrative that's being built is that if you have a field full of liberals, maybe they would be more lenient with sort of liberal leaning research, and that could result in the publishing of flimsy or liberally leaning findings that are not actually reliable or replicable. And of course, this sort of liberal groupthink can have other types of effects, right? Maybe that might result in liberal leaning findings being cited or discussed more. So there's a number of different things that you could look at here. So to tackle this question, we aggregated a database of nearly 200 original studies that were later subject to a replication attempt. And to our knowledge, this is the largest database of replications in the social sciences. And then we recruited psychology doctoral coders and lay MTurk coders, so just sort of like online coders from across the US political spectrum, from very liberal to very conservative. And we had them rate the political lean of the original research. And then we could test whether the political lean or the political slant of the original research predicts whether it later replicates, as well as some other factors like post-publication impact, like citation counts. And to avoid bias, we pre-registered all of our hypotheses and key analytic decisions with open science frameworks. And in fact, we actually joined forces with one of the other authors on that original paper I was talking about, Jarrett Crawford, as we were going through data collection and data analysis. So we got to sort of merge forces with someone from that original paper. Okay, so on to some sort of key results. So first we can ask, is the literature as politically skewed as the field? So I showed you earlier maybe some evidence that psychology and probably academia writ large is very, very skewed in favor of liberals or in favor of Democrats. And so you might expect that our science, the papers that we're producing, might be sort of equally as skewed. But here, if we look at the distribution of research, you actually see it's sort of a more normal distribution. And we actually don't see that the skew of the actual research tracks the skew of the field, right? There are more liberal leaning papers than there are conservative leaning papers, but it's not nearly skewed as maybe you might think. Okay, and then we can ask, are liberal leaning papers less replicable, right? This is sort of the key question. So we can look at the political slant of the original research and try and predict a binary outcome of do those papers later replicate or not. And here we don't find any evidence that political slant predicts replicability, right? If you were gonna find sort of evidence of like a liberal bias, you would maybe see this slant looking like this, where you would have really liberal leaning research over here, not replicable. And as you go maybe more conservative, it's really replicable or something like that, right? It could look a few different ways, but just to visualize this, here you're seeing kind of flat, no relationship between the political slant of the original research and replicability. And these results remain consistent regardless of the ideology of the coders that we had rating these articles, as well as whether they were expert, like doctoral PhD coders, or just lay MTurk coders, and after adjusting for a number of covariates. And then we could ask, are liberal leaning papers less statistically robust? So never mind just sort of replication on its own. Can we look at things like effect size and sample size of studies? And we can look at if political slant tracks that. And here we show that political slant shows no clear relationship to measures of statistical robustness. So here on the x-axis, you have the original study's effect size, and on the y-axis, you have the replication study's effect size. And so you're seeing sort of that, yes, effect sizes correlate with each other. So if the effect size of the original study is larger, the effect size of the replication might be larger. But importantly, you don't see that political slant is mapping on. You're not seeing clusters of red separate from clusters of blue. And so there's no actually clear relationship of political slant to statistical robustness. And then we can ask sort of some of these kind of downstream post-publication impact questions, like do liberal leaning papers receive more citations or online attention? So here you have citations and here you have a measure of online attention. And you actually, again, we don't find evidence that political slant predicts citation counts or altmetric scores. Again, if you were going to see this pattern of liberal bias, you might expect that liberal leaning papers are like super cited and conservative leaning papers are not cited at all, or vice versa. So you just maybe expect to see really strong negative relationships here, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. In fact, what you actually just see is that people like Tversky, like Nobel Prize winners are getting lots of citations, which is like not surprising, or common popular research on cooperation from Dave Rand that's getting talked a lot about online and social media. But it doesn't seem to be really related to politics. Then we can also ask, are papers that are more ideologically extreme less replicable, right? So never mind left versus right, liberal versus conservative, but just like if you're further on an ideological slant in general, does that predict less replicability? And here we see some sort of tentative evidence that ideological extremity actually predicts less replicability or a lower likelihood of replicability. I say tentative because we saw this analysis come out using the set of ratings from our PhD doctoral coders that we'd recruited from around the country, but we didn't see this using the lay MTurk coders. So there's sort of mixed evidence for this. So maybe there's some evidence for it, but it's sort of tentative at this point. Okay, so we asked, does our field's liberal imbalance mean our science is less robust or replicable? And this is sort of a first pass, but our data seem to suggest that there's no evidence that political slant of research is associated with scientific replicability or post-publication impact like citation counts. However, there may be some preliminary evidence that political extremity is associated with reduced replicability. Okay, so here I overviewed a few different papers about how the consequences of mentally aligning for collective behavior through different lenses on different domains, from social neuroscience and teams to social psychology and moral alignment, about ambiguous issues with people, with partners, and also just sort of like a broader, what if groups are all on the same page too much? And does that mean that we're kind of biased in the way that we do our research as scientists? And so hopefully this is kind of emphasize the importance again of these different collective phenomena and some of the consequences of mentally aligning and some of the risks of doing so. So with that, I want to wrap up and thank my dissertation committee for their feedback and input and for their time in all of this. Of course, I want to thank my lab and funding. I also want to take the next few minutes just to give some special thanks to some special people. So first, I want to shout out and give a very special thanks to my advisor, Jay. He has been a true pillar and force during my PhD. He's been an endless source of wisdom and inspiration. He's super optimistic and energetic and excited about science. And he has done a great job of embedding that into me and getting me through. And I would not be here at all without him. He's a part of all of these papers and he's a part of all of our thinking. And so this PhD process and journey has been very much a function of his mentorship. And so I'm very grateful for being under his wing all this time. I also, of course, want to thank the lab more broadly. Over the years, there have been a lot of people that have come through, but they've all made my experience super awesome and enriching. I've learned a ton from everyone in the lab and formed some really nice friendships. And I know I'm going to miss the lab. And so I'm just very happy that I was a part of this. I think this was one of the best experiences of grad school for me, was how fun and amazing the lab was and how smart everyone was that I got to be around and learn from. And so just a huge shout out and thank you to all of the folks who came through the lab and who have now graduated and folks who are in the lab now and are coming through the pipeline. I also want to give a special thanks and shout out to some of the co-authors on these papers that I talked about. Again, I'm up here spieling about stuff to you guys, but this is not just me. This is a super collaborative effort, specifically Suzanne and Ido on paper number 1, and Philip and Maya on number 2, and Julian, Billy, Peter, and Jarrett on number 3. These folks all helped with parts of the project and in shaping my thinking and then working on the papers themselves. So a big shout out to these folks. I would be remiss if I didn't also thank the very large number of research assistants that I've had over the past 5 or 6 years. Truly, as you might notice, some of the research that I'm doing is about groups and dyads, and this research, as Tessa and others will tell you, is hard. It's hard to run this kind of work, and it requires a team. And these are the people who are part of that team, who are actually boots on the ground, running subjects and running groups and scheduling and processing EEG data and cleaning transcripts. And it's a lot of work. And I would not be here without them. And so they deserve special shout out and recognition. And I'm very grateful for all of their support and assistance throughout this time. I also want to shout out to my cohort, who was such a fun group to be with, especially during the first 2 years when we saw each other a lot. And this is such a great photo. It just brings back a lot of fun memories of celebrating with the cohort and commiserating with the cohort and just the other people who are all going through the same thing as me and learning from them. And to Matt, my first year roommate, who is on the call here. So it's been great with everyone. And I just want to thank my cohort for everything that they've done and enriching this experience for me. Of course, I would be way to my league to not mention my parents, who are like the reason I actually exist in this world, but also just generally like give me my life source for support and pushing me forward to pursue my goals and ambitions. And I'm just I love them so much, and I'm so glad that they're here and that they're able to kind of encourage me through my grad school experiences. They've seen the highs and they've seen the lows, and they've been there through all of it. So I'm very, very grateful and thankful for them. Of course, obviously, the rest of my family, my brother and sister-in-law, Andres and Molly, and my sister-in-law's family are very much part of that same family unit. And I can't leave out my my little niece, Alina. She just turned 3 yesterday. So this one's for her. And I love you guys very much. Of course, generally the broader family, my cousins and on my mom's side here in the US, and my family on my dad's side in Chile. I'm very thankful for all of their emotional support, and people who are just as much family, the Watkins, Lynn and Charlie and Kelly, who've been there for my entire life for 30 years plus. And of course, I also want to thank all of my friends who have just been amazing and have made me a sane person when I probably seemed insane, or pulled me out of my room from working and writing, and encouraged me to socialize more, which is always a good thing, even though I'm already a social butterfly. So just a huge shout out to like a ton of close friends. There's way too many friends for me to try and like cover it all. I would be going on for another like 30 minutes, but I just wanted to highlight and flag out some really fun pictures that reminded me of really fun memories of really good friends that I've had in Boston and in New York over the past 5 or 6 years. Yeah, and it's just like amazing to see these relationships. And I think a lot of people were able to tune into the call today. And I got a lot of text messages from people in the past week or two wishing me well and support. And so I just feel very loved by all these people. So I'm very grateful and thankful. And finally, I want to just give a special shout out, of course, to my partner, Jen, who has been with me through this whole pandemic. And it's been a wild ride to try and manage, but she's been there for me time and time again, and has been supporting me like crazy the past few weeks. She knows that I've just been a zombie working on my dissertation and try and finish, and she's been there every step of the way. And so a very, very special thanks to her. She's a very special person in my life. And there's so many more people to thank. Again, I know that I would have spent days going through finding photos. So just for all of you that are here and that are not here, but maybe see this later, and for everyone else, just so many thanks to all of you guys. And yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Diego. You buttered up the entire audience, so I don't know if we're going to get how tough the questions are going to be. But let me first reciprocate your generosity by saying a couple things about you that really made you a special student. The first thing, in addition to obviously being talented and hardworking and having an incredible attention to detail, being really a critical scientist, the thing that I'll probably miss about you the most when you're gone is that you put in so much to the community, to our lab, to the department, to the program, and just an endless source of support and energy to other people. The other thing I think that really stands out to me about the work that you do is that you have a lot of courage. You have courage to do challenging research that's hard. Every one of these studies, I know how challenging and how much background work and piloting work went into it, but I also say you had courage to do topics that are potentially controversial. So I remember telling you in the lab before the last study that no matter what the results are, someone's going to hate us, and yet you bravely agreed to be the first author and plow into it. So I hope you'll be able to show some of that courage now as we invite anybody who's here to put up your hand if you have a question, and I'll do my best to moderate some questions from the audience.